Hi everyone, I'm Deborah Farber, Senior Director of Privacy Strategy at BigID. Welcome to Live from Black Hat with BrightTALK and ITSPmagazine. We're bringing to you a new era for privacy and data security. And I'm really excited to introduce my esteemed panel for the day. To begin with, how about you, Rishi?
Thank you. My name is Rishi Bhargav. I'm one of the co-founders for Demisto. Demisto is a security operations and incident management platform. And the whole idea is how to help customers with responding to incidents better, faster, in a more structured manner, and save the amount of time it takes to respond to an alert. That's me.
Thank you.
My name is Amber Welch. I'm a privacy technical lead with Shellman & Company. Shellman offers privacy and security attestation and audit. So I work solely with GDPR attestation.
Thank you.
Welcome. My name is Rick Moy. I'm head of marketing at Acalvio Technologies. We're an autonomous deception company, and we are making honeypots great again and making them useful and easy and efficient to detect and respond to attackers who've gotten past your security defenses and are roaming around inside your network.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing yourselves. And I know we're going to have a great time, a spirited discussion today, talking about a whole bunch of technologies and what's new in privacy and security. It's a bunch of trends. First, I guess I'll also introduce myself. I already mentioned my name, Deborah Farber. I work for BigID, and BigID does, we basically have solved for the challenge of understanding whose data is on your enterprise and where it's stored across the organization. And so I think all of our companies are going to be here at Black Hat, so if you're in town, definitely come visit our respective vendor booths. And okay, to get started, I think I'm gonna, the first thing I want everybody to know is we are gonna be taking questions. So throughout this time, I'll start you can enter in what your questions are, and I'm gonna be looking at our mobile device here, see what some of your questions are, and I'll be incorporating them into the discussion today. So please do use that feature. And then to start, I think we're gonna kick it off with something near and dear to my heart, which is data privacy. So this year we've seen GDPR has finally become enforceable in the EU. And let's kick off some of the discussion around privacy. First, Amber, do you think you can kind of just set the stage for data protection, talk about the differences in some terminology to begin with, maybe PII versus personal data and personal information?
Sure. Since May 25th, we've had basically a new era, as you as we have named the panel. So now that we're under this more European understanding of personal data, Americans are trying to expand their concept of what needs to be protected at that higher level. Europeans tend to see personal data as things that are personal to your identity, not necessarily your financial or health information like Americans do. They've also decided that things like IP addresses are personal data because it identifies a person in a pretty stable way. Potentially with the e-privacy regulation, we would be looking at browser fingerprinting as well. So there are some more technical considerations that go beyond just the standard social security number and credit card. So that's something that we really need to hit home in privacy and security awareness trainings as well.
Makes a lot of sense. So it seems like we're going from, in the United States, we've really looked at privacy from a consumer protection standpoint, where we only really regulate if there's been like an obvious harm. And then the EU with their definition of personal data, expands way beyond that to anything that's linkable to an individual identity. So, have you guys been hearing about how companies are trying to, get a handle on that broadened definition of information as they're trying to protect data?
So I think a couple of comments. So one is interesting, you mentioned the European and the American difference and definition of privacy, PII data. I'll just handle, what I'm actually noticing is, interestingly, pretty much take any Global 2000 or Fortune 2000 company. They're not American or they're not European, right? They have offices in both places. And when a lot of our customers, when we deal with, is when they're taking action on, says, hey, we need to be GDPR compliant and figure out where the PI data resides or located. It doesn't matter whether they're doing business in US, whether the end customer is in the US or Europe, because it's very hard to track the customer also, because the customer might have offices in both places as well. So I think what is happening is these companies need to deal with this, whether European or US. And the second part, I think because first of all, it's a good movement from the EU, and now it's pretty much going broader. So India recently announced, not really formally announced, but there's signs that they're talking about applying the same thing in the Indian subcontinent, just India. They're getting together and figuring out pretty much similar privacy laws. So I think to me, it's a bigger movement, which I think a very clear definition of PII would be put in place, and how to deal and how to respond will be there. So I think that's at least my thoughts on it.
Yeah, that's great. Do you have anything to add?
I do. I actually have a fun fact.
Oh, great. Tell us, inform us.
In preparation, because you guys are very serious, you've got it all buttoned down. So
We'll take that as a compliment.
on my
I'm
way
an
over
auditor.
here, of course you are.
I'm
I
wearing
figured-
curls just so I can clutch them.
I'm going to Google privacy, right? So I do that on my phone as I'm rushing over here. And Google asks me, says, hey, there's some unusual activity detected on your network. Sign that we are here at Black Hat, right? So it wants me to confirm that I'm not a robot. And so I tried to do that, and I failed. So obviously, hacking and AI are big topics here, along with privacy.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I think there is actually a tie-in there, right? We think about privacy from a security standpoint, but there's also a realization that marketers have been doing this for a long time. So the hackers and the marketers actually, if we start to unwrap it, are correlating data from different sources to figure out who a person is. A hacker may be doing it for a high-value target, right? And that's kind of the angle I'm coming from the hacking and attack side. Whereas a marketer is doing it to deliver an ad to the right person. Very similar uses, and I think
So when you say doing it, what do you mean? Like they're
doing the AI thing,
The AI.
right? The correlation, the ML. They're taking data, your browsing data, what your IP address is. I remember we were doing advanced research about 7 or 8 years ago on when I was running a company called NSS Labs that does security research and testing of products, and we were noticing that it was actually possible to fingerprint a browser. So this is 7 or 8 years ago.
Right.
Fingerprint a user based on their browser and activity and their desktop, what you could find from that
So
data.
fingerprinting basically
So-
means that you can use a whole bunch of insights from what somebody is using and be able to identify them as the same individual who's been taking actions elsewhere, or do you have a different definition?
Exactly. With a high confidence level, be able to say this set of data probably belongs to this set of data, and we can link them together and have a more holistic understanding about whether Mr. X has a health issue based on what he's been browsing, whether he's looking to take out a loan, right? Or whether he is accessing certain technical data pertaining to his work, right? And might represent a target of interest for a cyber criminal or someone
Absolutely.
involved in state espionage.
And I think this is one of those areas where that European definition becomes so pertinent, because in the US we tend to think PII is pieces of information. You can have a hard definition, where with the European definition, pieces that may not be personally identifiable individually can become that way. And sometimes without even the person who is compiling the information, who's the data controller, being aware that that's happening. These profiles can be organized, and you can look at them and very easily tell that, you can narrow down those demographics pretty well and potentially identify someone. And that's why what you do with data mapping is so critical. You have to understand what data you have and realize when you're getting to that point where a huge data set is actually becoming personal data.
Right, and of course we use machine learning and AI to enhance those capabilities. So I think to your point, there is definitely use cases for good, like what companies are trying to do to get a handle on their own information that they process or control. Right, there's the attackers are also using a lot of these techniques as well. Is that the point you were trying to make?
That's part of it. And
Yeah.
there's a trend, actually, and the trend is that the attackers are generally ahead of the defenders by
yes.
years, right?
Right.
And so, they started with testing, right? They built test labs to test antivirus, firewalls, intrusion prevention, so they could know how to get around it. They have implemented deception, right? Look at phishing, right? In order to evade our human defenses and the technical defenses that work off digital signatures, they figure out how to deceive those systems and the people in order to deliver their payload. And so now, fast forward, X number of years, and deception is becoming more relevant as a strategy for defense. Testing is certainly becoming more relevant.
Right.
We've always talked about pen testing and vulnerability assessment. Many organizations haven't understood the difference, except for the larger ones. But now we're seeing an evolution of those types of technologies where you can do automated and continuous testing of your network. And so
Right.
it's interesting that where there's money and finance involved, a criminal element will rush to it.
Of course, you go where the money is. Yeah.
Water runs downhill, right? And so the good guys are chasing that. It's about time.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. So that's really helpful then, right? Because now we're giving tools to the good guys to be able to at least be able to hold their own in some ways against some attackers out there. Clearly, there'll always be sophisticated hacks, especially by nation-state actors or hacktivists or those with the tools. But we're starting to. Continually, what I hear is that there are a lot of basic vulnerabilities that can easily be fixed, or if we had secure coding skills, or if our developers were trained better, maybe we wouldn't be putting out some insecure code in the first place. To what extent are you seeing that in the field being exploited
I think
versus more sophisticated hacks?
I would say probably the 80-20 rule. I think majority of, if you look at the number of attacks, majority of the attacks are the simple ones, right? And simple ones meaning the same thing, which is social engineering, existing vulnerability. Look at even the most widespread ransomware of recent times, right? All the last year, all the big ransomwares, pretty much simple vulnerability. Microsoft knew about it, exposed it, nobody patched it, so on and so forth. I think there is a small subset of attacks which are more complicated and sophisticated. The common theme, though, I think, which is again the emerging trend I see is whether it's a simple attack or a complex attack, you got to be prepared for it. I think the interesting point that Rick mentioned, which is a lot of the organizations have had defenses in place and now they're getting better defenses. But across the board, what everybody has realized is you're going to get breached. It's a matter of when and not if.
Right. And mitigating
that risk and figuring out what do you do when you get breached. And I think that's the important realization, and that holds with the data as well, right? Yes, you should do the right things to put the right data controls where it is, what is there. But when you do need to revoke that data, get asked to delete or the right to be forgotten, how do you plan for it? How are you prepared for it? What processes you have in place? And that's kind of a big message to take away for the audience, I think, is hey, are you thinking what to do when it actually happens across the board?
So when you said take away that data, were you referring to subject access requests?
Yeah, exactly. Subject access requests.
Under GDPR or
Yeah.
consumer access requests under the new California law?
Right.
Amber, do you mind kind of contextualizing that for our audience?
Sure. So
that
something
means?
that maybe not everyone is aware of yet, especially if it's a more American audience, since most of us don't have these rights. But if you are in the EU, then you can submit a request for various rights. So seeing what information a company holds on you, the right to access, portability, the right to have your information transferred to a similar organization in a machine-readable format, or the one that everybody is so excited about, the right to be forgotten, which is the right to complete and total erasure.
Someday I want to use that.
Yeah.
I'd like to forget what I did.
Yeah, exactly. In the next couple of days,
Yeah.
I guess. Huh?
So one of the things that that I have been noticing with this in particular is that organizations are very afraid of the GDPR fines. It's quite a hefty fine, up to 20 million euros or 4% of total annual revenue turnover, which is quite a lot, and globally, not just in the area where it happened. So some organizations are so scared of that they are not carefully vetting those data subject requests. So it's a new vector for a data breach in the attempt to provide these privacy rights. We're actually opening up a new area where I shouldn't be telling this audience that, giving them bad ideas.
No, but that's
That gives me a great idea.
That's a perfect time to actually explain how what the risk level is, because a lot of times privacy practitioners don't think in terms of security threats or being a vector. So I think this is a great bridging of that gap here, that by allowing or by saying that there's now a right to provide information that's been collected about an individual back to them, is how do we know that we're providing that data to the right person?
Absolutely.
Right?
If you call your credit card company, they ask you a whole lot of questions, and they won't let you just get information. They're not going to tell you your full credit card number over the phone, things like that. So now those identification requirements are something that anyone who has data that falls under that GDPR requirement needs to become familiar with. And most organizations who didn't have financial or health data really didn't have to think about identifying customers or end users in that way. So
it sounds like they're going to need to re-architect some of their business processes, or just a lot of data governance and privacy assessment on how organizations currently can provide that data in a scalable way, depending on how many consumers are actually asking for this.
And it's critical to, even though GDPR is a legal requirement, you can't have privacy without security. And so you have to bring in the technical people. You have to bring your security team in. It's not just something for the lawyers. You need to have good lawyers, but they need to work together. And even though they haven't always gotten along that well, not every technical person likes lawyers, and lawyers don't always like tech people, but you have to put them in the same room so they can think about these things together.
Right. I mean, I personally am seeing a lot of companies struggle with who owns the operationalization of this, right? A lot of it's privacy, like GDPR talks mostly about privacy requirements, some security. You need incident response. You need to be able to respond to report a breach within 72 hours, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But a large number of the privacy requirements, it's kind of unclear who within the organization is the chief security officer, is the chief privacy officer, is it the data governance officer, right? Chief data officer. Who's operationalizing this, or are you seeing trends across your clients?
I have mostly.
This will go to everyone else.
I have seen the legal teams tend to be the drivers behind it, which I think there are a lot of benefits to that. There's a lot of contractual information that you need to work through, especially with Privacy Shield under threat. The EU is considering revoking it, so that means everybody in the US is going to have to go back to standard contractual clauses, which would require usually a contract renegotiation for most of their companies. So that's a big deal, and it makes a lot of sense that the legal team would be driving that. It's just that when they don't share or make that really an interdepartmental effort, that there's a potential
or they might not have the budget.
They might not have
the
the
technology and any products that are associated with it.
Or the staff.
There's existing product lines and services that need to be evaluated, new technology implemented.
So if I understand correctly, Amber, you're saying the process of the GDPR implementation is owned by the lawyers, and then they are the ones managing the controls down to each of the security teams, or?
It seems to be a common approach. There are some organizations that have a strong security organization internally. So in those cases, maybe you have a governance team that would be managing that. But not every company that now falls under GDPR has historically had privacy as an internal skill. So they tend to outsource that to legal counsel.
The reason I ask is it's so funny. I myself as an individual have got so many emails. And we in fact did a comic strip internally where an alien comes in to Earth and kind of basically delivers here's our GDPR policy. We have updated our privacy policy, and there's this barrage of emails around May 25th, which is all the privacy policy updated. And I think, I don't know what the reality is, pretty much nobody read that update. Everybody was mandated to do those updates. And the interesting question, literally I was thinking through, is everybody updated those. There was laws behind, you need to update and these certain things need to be done. But from the consumer side, I don't think the average consumer understood the impact of what they gained or what they did not gain. And I'm curious, again, if you guys have thoughts, like, was the initial whole GDPR thing on the EU side was driven by some consumer groups, or was it more of a EU effort? Again, I think how much does the really consumer care for privacy? I mean, I, by the way, love when Google tells me a good recommendation because they know everything about me.
Right.
I'm okay as far as they give me a good recommendation. When not, then that's a question. I know.
So I have some thoughts on that. The EU's perspective, unlike us in the United States, where we come across, we approach privacy as consumer protection only when there's a harm we regulate. In the EU, they view privacy as a human right. And it doesn't matter if it's hard for businesses to comply or do. It's a human right. You got to respect the rights. Yep. And so we butted heads with the EU on this very approach because we're kind of like, hey, if in exchange for money, we want, we'll give you our info and we get a benefit out of it. That's capitalism. That's very United States, policy.
Our
for
people
many
are
years.
our product, right?
People are a product. There we go. We can sell that.
Thank you.
So there's been issues with privacy in the U.S. However, in the EU, it's been more around data protection. And data protection are the rights carved out for individuals. And so we're only seeing our first data protection law here in the United States with the California Consumer Privacy Act that will go in on be effective as of January 1st, 2020. And so kind of foresight is 2020 here, right? Sorry, I had to get that one in. And so I think that those approaches are what you're absolutely right. I think a lot of consumers receiving those emails were pretty much like on overload. Like, I'm not going to go and review everybody's policy. It's just too much of an effort, too much of a heavy lift. So,
There's probably also a sense of fatigue, right? Yes. That, hey, how many letters have I gotten? How many times over has my social security number been out there?
Reach fatigue.
I mean,
Absolutely.
They can probably correlate everything about my life at this point.
Right.
So what's there left to, it just feels kind of, fatalistic, right? What else is there that we can do?
Right.
Well, we can reduce the visibility into our future efforts, our tracking, right? So they may know who we are and what we did. It doesn't mean they're going to be able to identify what we're going to do in the future.
Exactly. And I think that's one thing that the advertising industry just can't even get from individuals is they could predict potential future behavior based on past behavior. But I might have bought that car offline and you're still showing me car, ads, right? So the attribution issue is still a challenge, and I might have bought it something on a baby registry for a friend, but I personally am not gonna be having children. So you can show me diaper ads until you're blue in the face. I'm never gonna buy those diapers.
So,
right?
By the way, you just said that on TV, on the internet. They all know now.
Now they all know, right? And it just shows you that at scale, it's going to be hard to just collect that information and tidbit about myself, right? So
if you're a company trying to do the right thing, or as an individual, I think this is where what's interesting is it's opening up new business model opportunities. For example,
talk to us about that. Yeah.
Well, there's, not to promote anybody, I can't even remember the name of it. Oh yeah, I do. I think it's there's a Brave browser where it has a different commerce model, right? Where people actually have to, pay you, the viewer, to see the ads that are on the different web pages. And I think that's interesting, right? Because it's shifting the control. Now it's young, it's got a very nascent in its track, but it's got some power behind it. And you mentioned the data portability. I know there's an effort to create open source interoperability between the different social networks and different applications to have a standardized format for your personal data that you can then take with you, take a copy, right? I don't know if they're going to destroy it, right? But you can probably get a view in a more standard, if you can read JSON or XML as a consumer, you may be in a good, be able to make use of that. So some new things are coming, and it's interesting.
So what do you think that? Well, maybe I'll save that question until later about the future landscape. So we'll take a question from the panel here for the panel. Okay, so someone asked, as a security professional, I always think about the security side of things. Phishing has taught us that painful lesson. Can your panel discuss how they work with U.S. companies who want to still do marketing, especially online behavioral marketing? Anyone have a behavioral marketing,
I'll take that
or
one.
combine it with phishing?
I'll take that one because
Okay,
I'm
thank
responsible for marketing at Demisto as well, and we're doing that. See, I think my view on this is, again, from a privacy perspective, and even if you look at the definition of privacy, none of these laws are saying that you should not have data to target the user with the right benefits. To my point again, right? I, as a consumer, I'm happy to be recommended the right set of products if I'm actually looking for the right set of products. I think the question here is nobody on the vendor side of the organization should be able to identify that user and be able to misuse the data. Right? So I think
Great
if
point.
you do the right controls as a vendor, you have a point there. So
No, finish
let
your
me
thought,
finish it.
then
So
we'll let-
it's
we'll let Rick
interesting.
jump
I'm
in.
going to let you finish.
Yeah. As a vendor, if you do the right things to be able to anonymize or completely abstract this user entity as a unique identity, target them with the right set of offers, but focus on what is valuable to the user. So there's a whole side which is, hey, are you really annoying the user or not annoying the user? That's I'll leave it out there. But to me, at least, my principle is very simple. It's like, hey, the user, the first time they engage with your business is because they want to learn about your product, or they want to learn about the space, or they want to learn about general topics that the business has to offer.
Right.
So get them the right information, and for that, you do have to track them to some extent, right? And the thing is that users should be tracked, but de-identified at the right level so that nobody in my organization, if they have access of some sort, is able to misuse that data.
Although there's that caveat that you may feel that you have de-identified it. But true anonymization is very difficult. And then the more that machine learning and AI advances and the more data you collect, there's going to come this crisis point where one day you have a whole database of personal data and you didn't realize you were collecting it. So it's really critical to look at, especially under GDPR, there are several different legal bases for processing data. So if you feel that those people really do want that information, like you want those recommendations, you can operate under a basis of consent.
Yeah, so that makes sense. Yeah, so I think
you
that
don't have
consent
to-
is important. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think to me, that's the biggest thing.
Okay, jump on in.
Raise your hand if you give away consent to things that you don't really understand, just so you can get.
Everyone.
There have been times,
That's
I think
why-
it's a human
right?
thing, and even
Yeah.
as I think it's wonderful
convenience.
that as security professionals, we're even
The
letting people know we
lawyers
do.
got me, right?
Yeah.
They got us all because we're not willing to invest the time to read that 9-point font about what's actually going on there. And so an organization may be trying to do the right thing, and de-anonymize and protect that data, but at some point that may become a business reality where the CEO says, hey, to generate an extra revenue stream,
Right.
we're going to sell that data to our partners, right? De-anonymize it. Hey, Joe, go send that XML data over there to
Right.
company X, right? Or, hey, we're going to import, and there may be these cross correlations and joinings of data that come. So maybe my financial history, my bank history, that's in the news now, right? Can bank history combined with my social networking activity yield some interesting results? It could be used
Yep.
in a way that I wouldn't like, or that is unintended or unforeseen.
Absolutely.
We just don't know. So there should be it's interesting, right? Because we as a society now probably generally like to have a conversation with the folks who are making those business decisions about their businesses,
Right.
in which we are the product, right? About our future identity and therefore privacy and security. By the way, as a side note, it's amazing, how many businesses still don't salt or hash the passwords that they store.
Absolutely.
That is ridiculous.
Not naming any names.
I know, but that one just gets me, right?
Here,
A
yeah.
whole bunch of bad practices.
It's
still out there.
2018,
Right.
guys, right?
So
And
that's one takeaway to any small businesses out here: salt and hash your passwords.
So, yeah, or talk to someone who
Password
does.
breakfast.
You don't get it from Diner.
Exactly. So yeah, that you made some really interesting points there. So let's see. Let's turn our attention now, I guess, to some new approaches for thwarting attackers. I know Rishi and Rick, you both have a lot to say about this, but Rick, let's start with you. It's basically what your company does, right? I mean, There's some honeypots that you create to, I mean, why don't you tell us, actually, I'll let you, I won't put words in your mouth, but what are some of the new approaches that you're seeing come out in the market?
In the spirit of deception, you should
Yeah.
put some words in my mouth.
Indeed.
So, I mean, deception, I love the topic. It's been around for millions of years in Mother Nature. Warfare, we've used it. And I think it's a concept whose time has finally come because of the confluence of a couple technologies. AI is one. Software-defined networking is another. And containerization, the ability to put things, this DevOps environment that we now live in, you can easily put things that are real and fake amongst each other and blend them in and have control and knowledge over where they are. So as a security practitioner, you have the ability to orchestrate an alternate reality for the attacker. And turnabout is fair play. We know that from our personal lives, right? And our social interactions. So why not turn about the deception against the attackers, since they're using it on us every day, and my inbox is filled with deceptive come-ons and
Explain to us what providing this deceptive virtual reality for them almost, what are the benefits to organizations would be?
I mean, the key takeaway for an organization is you really move a false attack surface closer to the attacker, and you shorten that time to detect. Right? On average, the attackers are wandering around in your network about, depending on the report you read, 150 to 250 days.
Wow, that's so long.
So if you can shrink that to half or even to a couple weeks, you're ahead of the game, right? And what the regulation is 3 days. Is that 3 days from when it happens, or 3 days from when you know?
When you know.
Yeah.
When it happens.
So that's it's
No
a
one
sliding
will
3-day
decide.
window,
When it
right?
happens.
But we all know from software development that the longer something goes on, the more costly the bug. Same thing with a hack. So
Absolutely. That's fascinating. So would you actually just unpack quickly for us what you mean by containerization, like Docker containers, I'm assuming, and also, what did you say, software-defined networking?
Right.
Okay,
Right.
that's a new one for me, so I'd love to hear just a brief, I'm sure our audience would as well.
So real quick, software-defined networking is, in the old days you had hardware, Cisco, Juniper routers, in order to segment and connect networks, right? Well, now everything's pretty much connected. How do you reconnect things that are physically disparate and far away from each other? Or how do you make things that are close to each other look separate, right? Without having to, get a wrench and, plug
Right.
something in, right?
So you
need
really
to
are
understand-
talking virtual reality. You're creating an
It's
experience that's not actually true.
That makes it sound sexier than it I
It
think
does.
actually
I'm
is.
thinking
But
about
yeah,
here
it's-
down the street at the MGM Grand.
Yeah.
There's this great, you could start fighting the zombies or whatnot, and it made it seem like when I did that the last time I was in Vegas, made it seem like you were in an elevator that was actually going down, and you really, it's virtual reality. It changes your
Yes.
perspective.
The packets are going up and down.
Well, there you go. It's an elevator.
Yeah, and so in containerization is the layer on top of that at the data layer, where you're saying, hey, the app doesn't just live in the data center. In fact, that app consists of these 5 services, which I've wrapped into these little modules. And instead of worrying about the OS, I just put those modules. And if I get a heavy load, well, I need more of module 1 and 2, but not 3, 4, and 5. So I can spin up those modules separately, whereas previously, from an app standpoint, they were monolithic. And you installed an app on an OS, and that was it. And in the old days, before we had the cloud, you would drive down to Rackspace or wherever, and you put another piece of hardware in there. Well, now you can your applications are basically being written in a containerized fashion, so the orchestration engines like OpenShift, Kubernetes, et cetera, which is driven by Google, can say, all right, we need more of these over here. You administrators don't need to worry about whether that's in Virginia or New York, because we're going to take care of it. And you don't have to worry about how many physical pieces of hardware it's sitting on.
Right.
We'll take care of it. We're going to deliver to you application performance, which is what you actually care about. And so they abstract
That's
out
helpful.
all those other details. And so all those things that are happening on the technology and IT front that people are calling DevOps or DevSecOps enables you to move very quickly in an automated, scripted fashion, delivers a huge amount of value from the security perspective, because we can now automate and orchestrate our responses, our detections, and our workflow past certain events, either using AI or simple programmatic rules. And that's something that
Right.
Rishi's company is really
Yeah,
involved in.
jump right in
Perfect
there.
plug. Thank you, Rick. Yeah, so I think the way I would put it is, I think, to me again, the world is evolving where we need to put better, smarter traps out there.
I love that word,
deception.
traps, by the way.
And then the second part is still whatever you do, be prepared that you will have to respond. And I think there's two parts of response. It's actually very simple. All humans, we've done that, is like plan and automate, right? Whether you're planning a party, whether you're planning an event, whether you're planning a webinar. So you got to have
Party.
certain, you're going to have a set of events, right? So first do this, then do this. And if it is too hot, put sunscreen, beach party, whatever, right? And the idea, the same thing applies when you're thinking about the security posture, right? So it's like, assume you're going to get an alert or you're going to detect a breach. What are the things need to be done? When it's in California, you need to take these 20 steps. When it's in Europe, this is what needs to be done within first 72 hours, detect this, do this. And then a subset of these steps, can you automate? Right? Can you automate the discovery of the data? Can you actually automate the delivery of the notification? Can you actually automate putting block rules across your endpoint, your network?
Right.
Can you deploy a new security control? So I think from my perspective, what we are focused on, and which is where kind of our message is, let's actually assume you have done a fantastic job of putting the right controls in place. Now those controls eventually need to be used for automation when you detect something. And that is where we come in, which is we help you prepare better. So we help you throughout the incident response process, build your workflow. It's like pretty much like Visio. I think the idea is think of every step that you do, draw like a Visio diagram, and then take some of these steps and automate that. Effectively, as I say, is like, hey, we are built for the lazy person in the security org, which is plan and automate and then make your life easy. But I think the end result, it's very interesting. The common theme that we've talked is like, how do you shrink that time? So you mentioned like, hey, is it 72 hours from the detection? Is it 72 hours from the first time it happened? I mean, we've talked a lot like shortening the time to detect. And the other theme is shortening the time to respond. So how do you
And then
reduce that
report.
mean time to respond and respond effectively? I think
That's really helpful. Yeah, you
And
were
I would
gonna add
say, I don't know many lazy people in security. They're all overworked, and we got a shortage of
I know, absolutely.
what, 1.5 million security professionals. So it's really adding automation to the grunt work, right?
Yeah,
Right.
The stuff that actually should be automated.
Which seems to be one of
It's
the
the-
major trends that I'm seeing in this new era for data privacy and security would be using AI and machine learning to leverage automation so that to kind of do the work that humans really shouldn't be spending their time doing.
Yeah, and I think it's so amazing that we did this recent survey. There's some results out there, which is on an average it takes 9 months to hire a security analyst for an organization.
Yeah.
It takes 3 months to train them, and their average tenure is 17 to 18 months.
Okay.
So you basically almost spent a year to hire and train them,
Wow.
and then they leave after 18 months. So guess what? It's
Yeah.
like how much time is wasted. To your point about the grunt work, nobody's happy in the amount of work they're doing.
I'm sorry, nobody's happy.
In the amount of grunt work that they're
Right.
doing on a daily basis,
Right.
and automate the grunt work.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then just, I guess, quickly on this follow-up, but it seems to be that most of the AI machine learning, wonderful automation tools are made for enterprises. Do you have some good, just for the small business owners out there, do you have some good tips on maybe some tools, maybe open source or something that, that can help with that?
I would actually recommend the small businesses to not go open source. Not
Okay.
because
Okay.
I think truly they're free, but they're really expensive when you try to get them to operate. Right? And I would actually not say that, hey, go buy the enterprise level products. Of course, products like ours starts at 100,000, goes up. I think the recommendation, and it's a very tough choice to make, is go to an expert, find the expert. How do you judge the expert? And figure out an outsourced service provider of some sort who can help you bring the right tools and consume the enterprise tools via a different route. Because managing and operating tools inside of your organization with a short staff is hard.
Right.
And one point for the small business owners in particular is that if you're looking at doing a cloud migration, usually regionalization is at that higher enterprise level. So that's one of the dangers. If you do fall under privacy law, you want to make sure that you're really aware of where your data is being hosted. That move to serverless and total virtualization can mean that your data is replicated in regions you aren't even aware of if you're not really watching for that. So it's something to keep in mind when you're looking at the contracts that you are opening up.
Absolutely. In fact, I would even throw out there, and this is a plug for Big Idea, of course, but like it's super important to understand where your data is located, just to be able to comply with the various regulatory, frameworks. And some countries don't let you export that data outside the country. Others, you're not allowed to process outside the EU unless certain conditions are met. So agree that it's really important to have a data-driven approach and not just use recalled memory in surveys that are really prone to either error or individuals not knowing the true nature of where data is stored in the organization. Yeah.
Absolutely. And under the GDPR, access is a form of processing. So even if you're just remote access in another region, then that still counts. So be aware of what you're doing, where you're getting the data, where it's flowing. That's why data mapping is so critical. Make sure you actually understand what countries these places are in.
And there's some automation on the market right now. So I definitely see that as a new trend, for sure.
I'm just made me wonder on the fly here if that's impact anyone's backup and disaster recovery scenarios, right?
Yes. Yeah, because you want a regionally disparate set of backup sites.
Absolutely.
So people get Canada, or they're doing another continent entirely, and if they're replicating that data, then all of a sudden they are
creating more risk,
creating compliance risk, even if they're reducing security risk. So you have to make sure that you're balancing some of that, because you want to reduce the potential for a data breach. Sometimes what you do to do that is introducing privacy or just legal risk.
Absolutely. So you want to copy all your data as little as possible. You try not to do it at all, even, right? But you want that intelligence on the data that you do have to know where it is. So it's definitely a hard problem to solve, but I would caution organizations not to create like another data lake that would just be easy to, once you compromise that, you now have the keys to the kingdom.
Everyone in security knows that constant battle between availability and security. Now you have to add privacy into that mix.
Absolutely. But I love how they're all coming together to converge. And if I just with the time we have left, I'd like to actually turn the topic now to kind of assurance. How do we, what are some of the new trends in attestation and assurance, and knowing that like what you've done either is complying with regulations or standards, and but at the same time also good security, good privacy, not just check the box. Amber, do you want to kick us off with that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is my bread and butter. So I think something that's critical to understand here is the roles for internal and external professionals. You might have people internally who are driving it, who can do internal audit to make sure that you're complying with the regulations and understand how those regulations apply to your business. And then, of course, legal counsel is going to be involved, either internal or external. I think that's less critical which side that's on. But since there's no certification currently, and we haven't had any enforcement actions yet for GDPR, getting a third-party attestation or even just a readiness assessment gives some kind of credit in the bank. It shows that you're putting effort to understand what it is that you need to do, what you need to remediate, and right now there's very little else that you can do to really show what effort you're putting in. So attestation can be that final piece in your armor, in a sense. Good security, good legal understanding, and then outside review.
So what about using like internal professionals versus external? So internal audit versus external audit, even setting, I mean, you could even talk a little bit about like risk management too. If you bring internal, are you setting up, how do you manage risk and then audit, and then using internal resources and external resources?
Sure. Well, there's a lot to that.
Yeah.
So the internal aspect is really where you're going to get your subject matter experts to open up, be very honest, hopefully, in a mature and healthy organization. So one of the benefits there is that you can truly do the technical work necessary. The reason that you would do an external audit is more for that compliance assurance in the event that you had, say, a data breach and the regulators come knocking. If you've done some kind of independent assessment or attestation, then it shows that you have something without any conflict of interest. You brought someone in, and it's really a show of good faith. So those two should work together, and in a really ideal situation, your internal compliance and governance would work with an external auditor or assessor.
Got it. Okay. Super helpful. Do you want to have
No,
things to add
I
to
think
that?
nothing to add. That was
So we're
fantastic.
going to also take some of the questions here. I mean, I'm kind of weaving them into the conversation as we go along. But so since we're at the 15-minute mark, I think I'm going to jump in and ask actually some follow-ups before I get to the questions. So what are you hearing from regulators right now?
The regulators have been pretty silent, to be
Okay.
honest. I have heard some chatter that there are a few large organizations, primarily the big financial organizations, that have a direct line to regulators when the regulators will tell them what kind of evidence they should be retaining. The rest of us plebeians don't have that, so we're guessing right now, kind of taking the news that comes from Brussels as they trickle out.
As they trickle out, exactly. So, GDPR is new, and we're only starting to see some enforcement actions. What are you advising your clients right now in terms of how they can best satisfy regulators?
Sure. I think
specifically around privacy laws, and then, which also includes breaches and incident response.
Absolutely. So I think that the best approach is to take a very broad risk mitigation strategy. So you want to look at, and the GDPR is not actually that big. It's fairly short. You could probably read, if you only read chapters 2 through 5, it might be something like 20 pages.
I wish someone had advised me on that a while back. I read the whole thing.
Yeah, it's really not that difficult to get through. There's only a few articles that are relevant. You need to understand whether you're a controller or a processor before you do anything else. That is step one. If you don't understand that, you might be trying to comply with things that aren't relevant to you or missing other things. So that is the first thing that you should do. And then from there, look at the articles. Just open it up, see what requirements apply to your organization, and try to do something. If you decide that something doesn't apply to you, document your rationale, have your lawyer sign off on it, and say, we didn't follow this thing because we didn't feel that it applied to us.
So always document anything that
Yes.
doesn't apply or that you believe. So your kind of your
Right.
regulatory compliance stance.
Right. We didn't ignore it. We just chose to not follow it because we didn't believe that it was required of us.
And so how do data protection officers, which are a new requirement, a new role that's been around in Germany for a while, but has now kind of become EU. A requirement for for companies that operate in the EU, but not every company, right? So,
Right.
do you mind just kind of briefing us on the role of the DPO and how they work with the auditors?
Sure. Yeah.
And kind of have that attestation function as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there are two new roles that are included in the GDPR, actually. The DPO, which everyone has heard of, and then the EU representative. So there's some differences there. They're not the same person. The EU representative is someone who resides in the EU, ideally in the country where you may have operations. So not every company is going to need to do that if you don't actually have a base there. It depends on your situation. Get a lawyer to tell you.
Specifically, the representative is if you don't actually have representation, like an office in the EU, but you do business in the EU.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
If
Yeah.
you have a branch there, you'll likely just designate someone as the point of contact. It's somebody that the data protection authorities can contact if there's an issue, so they don't have to try to contact some faceless organization. But the data protection officer doesn't have to be in the EU. It's just someone who is there to be a privacy expert, understand the law, have enough technical knowledge about the industry to advise in compliance and some security aspects where there's overlap. But not everybody has to have a DPO. It's only for high volume or high risk, the sensitive data categories. But again, it's pretty vague right now. The GDPR doesn't give a lot of specifics about what they mean by a high volume. You're kind of
I was
guessing
going to ask
here.
that. It's
Got
like
it.
high volume meaning what?
Right. So that's why if you decide that it doesn't apply to you, write down why you think it doesn't and have a lawyer sign off on it
Got
so
it.
that you have some kind of protection. But you can have a part-time DPO. You don't have to have a full-time person, and that person can have other responsibilities, although there are some limitations. Like they can't be a C-level executive.
Right. So and there's So I'm getting a signal that I'm supposed to be wrapping up. I thought we had some more time, but I want to thank my panel today for the wonderful conversation and all your insights. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.